what I've got scrolling there, the work that we're doing in Hollywood in memory of Helen Johnson is ongoing, and that's just some of the things that have been done, and some of them still needing done. That's one thing that I found, and that's what found when we dug down a little more. That's a little more professional job Mike Alexander's gonna have. That's what I dug up a week or so ago. It's about that deep in the ground. And I was actually looking for a different one when I found it. So that work is ongoing. Mike and David have been doing some stone repair. I've been doing some cleaning and a little bit of stone repair. So the work that we're doing in memory of Helen at Hollywood is in progress and still ongoing and still working. So if you get a chance, you might want to ride through there just one day. It is amazing after these stones have been cleaned for a few weeks. There are two in there that are just absolutely snow white. And they're two that Joe Exum moved from a family cemetery a few years ago when it was going to be developed over. And they are the earliest two in the cemetery, and they're just as white as that paper right there to where Joe cleaned them. It's shocking when you see them. So, any other business that anybody has at this point? David Mayo is in Chicago on business. Steve is on vacation. And David asked me to introduce the speaker tonight. So I've got to tell y'all that our speaker tonight is one of the most fascinating and charming individuals that I've ever met in my life. He's one of my favorite people. No, seriously, a year ago or so, we did a program about finding and using old records and how you needed to be able to interpret them and what to do with them. And I want to do more on that tonight, except that this time I'm going to talk about marriage records. And if you'll excuse me just a minute, I'm having technical difficulties here. I'm one of those people that I can't work without a mouse. And we were having to unplug it for a minute. Now I've got to start all over, retrain myself. Okay. I want to talk about marriage records because I think that too often we try to look for records in today's context rather than at the time that the records were produced. And if we do that, it doesn't work because laws were different, customs were different, and we have to understand what was going on at the time to understand how to find and how to use what we've got. Now, obviously, marriage records are one of the most important records as a genealogist we can find. There's the obvious things that we find from them, the bride's maiden name, the date they got married. We can also get an estimate sometimes of how old the couple was. We at least know on the bottom end that they weren't any younger than a certain age. We can get a pretty good estimate of when they started a family, because in those older families, most of y'all have probably seen that within a year or two, they started having children. If you're lucky and you find one with the preacher's name on it, it might tell you something about their background. Because if you can find what church the preacher was part of, that tells you more about the family. If they got married by a Presbyterian preacher, they were probably Scots-Irish. If they got married by an Anglican priest, probably more likely to have been English. It can even tell you about the bride's family connections, because a lot of times, even though you know the bride's maiden name, you may not know what family she's from, who her daddy was. So look for other names in regards to that. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Now, in early Virginia, and that's where I'm going to talk about first, statewide recording of marriages didn't start until 1853. That doesn't mean that the records aren't there before that. That's just when it became a function of the state. Up until then, marriage was between the county court clerk and the local priest or the churches. So it should be simple enough. All you've got to do is go to the right county, look it up in the county record books, and there's your marriage record, case closed. Boy, that was easy, wasn't it? But it never works that way because somebody always throws a monkey wrench in the system. And it helps if you know that area or know those laws or what was going on. Let me give you a more recent example. I was born and raised, I've never lived anywhere but Jackson. My parents were born here. All four of my grandparents married here. So finding my mother and daddy's marriage license should be simple, right? Just go right down to the Madison County Courthouse. But if you're from this area, you know that in the 40s and 50s, when young people wanted to get married and they didn't exactly have permission, what'd they do? I see you already pointing, Lori. They went to Corinth, Mississippi. Brenda and I were at the library in Florence, Alabama a year or so ago, and I heard the librarian telling the lady, well, if you don't find it here, try looking in Iuka, Mississippi, because that's where all the teenagers used to go. Now, I did manage to find a very rare photograph taken of Highway 45 South going from Jackson to Corinth on a Friday night a few years ago, and that's about what stopped me from looking.
Go and get married.
The point being that if you don't know that for somebody who came in from out of town, they would be looking in Madison County for a record, and you'd probably have Edwin would have to send them to Corinth, Mississippi, probably to find it. So you need to know the laws of that area and the customs of that area. So first I want to look at what the marriage laws were in Virginia. Before 1853, that's when they started having state-required registration. Up until the American Revolution, in other words, when we're still under British rule, the official state church in Virginia was the Episcopalian Church, or the Anglican Church. For you to get married, you had to go through that church. Now, 2 years before, in 1780, they had passed a law that said if a preacher from another church registers with the county and gets written permission from the county court, he can perform weddings. This is William Graham, who was a Presbyterian minister, and he has gotten permission in writing in the county court minutes to perform weddings. If he did one without that written permission, he went to jail, and the couple was not considered married. So marriage was strictly a function of the church, more so than of the government. So you had government functions and church functions. And the government did not perform weddings. You couldn't go to the courthouse. You couldn't go to the county judge like you can now, because they were two different things. And you had two different governing bodies, one for the county, one for the church. The county, the colony, had counties, same as most states do today. And the church was set up by parishes. And one thing that catches us sometimes is that the county boundaries and the parish boundaries did not match up. They weren't the same thing. The counties seemed like they were laid out more in geographical terms. Maybe a certain size, or maybe over to the river's bank, or to the edge of the mountains. And parishes were laid out more in population terms, for whatever a parish church or a parish priest could handle. So in a big open area, you might have only one parish covering several counties. But in a more heavily populated area, you could have just the opposite. You could have several parishes in one county. Think of it, whereas today, maybe legislative districts. You go to a city like Chicago or Los Angeles, they're going to have several congressmen from that one city. But then you get in West Tennessee, where it's a little more rural, and you've got one congressman for several counties. So the parish was more on population than on actual size. And when a parish got too crowded, they would divide it. This is what was originally Cumberland Parish in Virginia in 1746. And within 40 years, it had been divided into 7 or 8 different parishes. So when they divided one, there was more than one way they could go about it. Sometimes they would just divvy it in half. The original parish kept half, and they created a new one for the other half. Sometimes they threw out the whole name completely and started from scratch. And so what you had happen was, just like with creating new counties, over time, somebody could live in the same spot and yet be in more than one parish or more than one county. If you look at somebody who lived in southeast Madison County in the 1860s, then within a few years, you're gonna find them in Chester County. They probably never moved, but they created a new county around them. And this could happen with parishes. Now, where this can help you is that a lot of times in those old records, they would mention, in addition to, or sometimes even instead of, what county they were in, they would mention what parish they were in. And this can narrow down the area that you're looking in. It can help you limit the scope of where you're looking. For instance, in today's terms, if you're researching two families, both from Madison County, and you think they're kin to each other, early Madison County, and then you find that one of them lived in District 13, which, if I'm not mistaken, is out towards Spring Creek. Or maybe that's 12. But anyway, the district is towards Spring Creek. And the other one lived in District 1, far end of the county. Now, by knowing what part of the county they lived in, you probably see that they're a lot less likely to have anything to do with each other if one lived in Denmark and one lived in Spring Creek than you would have known just by finding them in the same county. Now, there's a couple of things to know and remember about parishes, is that sometimes there were parishes and counties with the same name. They weren't the same thing. One that I remember in particular is there was a Brunswick County, Virginia, there was a Brunswick Parish, Virginia. Two totally different places. Today, you've got a town of Henderson, you've got Henderson County. They're two different places. You've got a city of Jackson, and way up in East Tennessee, you've got Jackson County. Two totally different places. So make sure that you're paying attention to whether you're reading the name of the county or the parish, or you might throw yourself off. I don't know how many times I have looked at people's family trees on Ancestry.com who are not from this area, and they probably don't realize they're doing it. And they find that their ancestor lived in Madison County, Tennessee, and they type in Madison, Tennessee, and it comes up, town of Madison, Davidson County, Tennessee. And they probably don't even realize what they've done if they're not from here, that they put themselves in Davidson County instead of Madison County. Now, there were two different ways to get approval to marry. The first thing is that the groom could get a marriage license from the county, and then he took that license to the parish priest, and that showed him that there were no legal impediments to them being able to marry. And at that point, the wedding can take place immediately. The license always had to be bought in the county where the bride lived. So that's going to tell you a little something. They couldn't go to Corinth and get married. They had to buy the license where the bride lived. This is from Henrico County, which is Richland. And you see here it says an account of all the licenses granted in this county, and then it's a listing of the recent marriage licenses that have been bought. Now, to get a license, the groom had to give bond at the courthouse. Somebody had to stand security for him, swearing that there was no impediment to them being able to marry and that he wasn't going to back out. There wasn't any money changing hands here. It wasn't that you had to put down a cash deposit or anything. But that bondsman is naturally going to be somebody that either was close kin to or knew well the groom. Think about co-signing a note for somebody. Are you going to co-sign a loan for somebody that comes up to you in the parking lot and asks you to? I hope not, anyway. But you might for somebody that you know very well, maybe even for a relative, I don't know. But look at who that bondsman was, because it's either going to be a family member or a close friend. And it could very well be somebody from the bride's family. So watch especially if the last name is the same as the bride's, because it's probably either her daddy or maybe a big brother. And this practice of needing bonds for marriage lasted until 1849. So anytime up until then, you should have it. Now, one thing to remember here is that just like when most of us probably got married, you didn't buy the license the day of the wedding. And so that bond and the actual date of the wedding are probably going to be a few days off. And so sometimes you see one person's family tree that says they got married on November the 11th, and you see somebody else's family tree that says they got married on November the 14th. And it may be that one of them's got the bond date and one of them's got the wedding date. And for some people, that might not be a big deal, but if you're one of those people who is a stickler for having the perfect date, that's the reason why you may get a few days difference in the two. Now, once he had the license, he takes it to the preacher who then performs the wedding. And if it's an Episcopal church wedding, as up until the Revolutionary War they all were supposed to be, it's then recorded in the parish register book. And they were supposed to note on the bond, I performed this wedding on such and such date. Good luck. I don't think I've ever seen that very many times where the preacher actually wrote that on there. Now in Virginia, where we still are at this point then, each minister is supposed to keep a record of the marriages that he had performed, and he's supposed to provide those to the county court every 3 months. This is from Middlesex County, and this one goes back to the 1690s, and it's his list probably from the parish register of all the weddings that this preacher in the parish had done during these months in 1690 and 1691. And then after 1784, after we changed from British government to American government, you only had to go once a year to turn those in. Regardless, it was not always really well enforced. Some did it, some probably didn't. So a lot of those ministers' weddings probably never made it into the county record books. If they did, then the county clerk records those in his register book. Now here's the thing you can very well run into, is because the minister is coming at some interval and giving a list of all the weddings that he's done, and the clerk records them, and then a few days later another preacher gives him a list, they're not always going to be in real good chronological order. And if you're not careful, if you think you have a wedding, say October 1775, and you look in the book and you say, well, here's July, here's August, and now it skips to December, mine's not there. I've looked back and forth several pages, because as you can probably see on this list, on the left-hand column, you've got all the weddings that John Chapel has performed over the course of a year. And then you've got a couple of other preachers. And then over on the right side, you've got Edward Almond, who obviously was the most popular preacher in the county because he's done by far the most weddings. And he's got all of his weddings. Well, his first one on the list occurred almost a year after John Chapel's last one, or a year before, I'm sorry. So they're not in exact chronological order. So go back and forth. I would go up to a year or so looking for the one that you have. They may be in there and you just don't want to buttonhole yourself into just that exact timeline. Now the alternative to getting a marriage license was you could go the route of the bands. And the first thing is, bands meant a whole different word to them than what we think of today, where today we think of it more in terms of a rule against it. Buying the marriage bands meant that you posted in the church closest to where the bride lived your intention to marry. And for 3 straight Sundays, the priest was supposed to announce from the pulpit the intent of this couple to marry. If they lived in different counties, they had to do it in the church closest to where each of them lived. But it especially had to be done closest to the bride's church. After 3 weeks, if nobody has come up with a legitimate reason why they shouldn't be able to marry, then the priest or the preacher can perform the wedding. Now, there was a couple of advantages to doing this. Any of you remember the Alan Jackson song a few years back, I'm married to a waitress and I don't even know her name?
Yeah.
Okay, waiting 3 weeks kept some poor kid from waking up on Saturday morning and saying, what did I do last night? He had to wait 3 weeks before he could actually marry. But the main reason was the cost. In 1705, the cost of a marriage license in Virginia was 45 shillings, or 450 pounds of tobacco, which was their going currency at the time. If you went the bands route at the same time, the cost was 6.5 shillings. Now, I don't know anything about what the exchange rate, what that would be worth today. But let's just pick a number out of thin air and say the cost of a marriage license was $70. The cost of the bands was $10. Now think about if you're a newlywed couple, rented your first apartment, you're driving an old clunker, you've got student loans, and you're working 2 jobs and eating ramen noodles. That $60 could come in pretty handy, couldn't it? So if I can wait 3 weeks, I need the $60. And to further confuse the issue, when it came up closer to the revolution, inflation ran wild, and the cost of a marriage license went up to 5 times what it had been before. So the cost difference was enormous. So most people went the route of the marriage bans. After the revolution, when they didn't have an official church to announce these in anymore, they relaxed the laws a little, and they said you can announce the bans at any big public gathering like court day or militia day. Now how that worked as far as announcing them 3 times, I don't know. But at any big public gathering, you could announce the marriage bans. And this lasted until 1848 when they said you've got to have a marriage license. No more bans, license is the one way to go. Now the problem for us, and this is a preacher who actually kept a record of the exact dates that he read the bans in church. I don't know who this Reverend T.W. looks like Burridge or Brundage was, but he had to have been a genealogist, because this nice guy, the record that he gave us, that he's actually got the exact dates. He tells us that one was a bachelor, one was a spinster. He's got the dates that he read them in front of the congregation, where they lived, both in this district. This is a perfect genealogy record. I wish everybody did as good a job with them. The problem that the bans causes us, though, is that bans were only recorded in the parish register book. Unless the preacher just happened to turn them into the county clerk for him to make a record of it, they never got into the county records. They were only part of the church record. So it should be as easy as just going to your parish register book, right? Here's Overwork Parish, St. Peter's Parish. Here comes the monkey wrench again. Over time in Virginia, there were 175 different parishes. Some lasted a few months, some lasted for years and years. How many of those parish registers do you think still exist? Oh, come on, somebody take a shot. About 20 out of 175. And even then, they may not cover the whole time period that the parish existed. This one for St. Peter's is almost 100 years. Your eyes aren't going bad on the Middlesex one on the right, it just didn't enlarge very well. But it covers about 160 years. The one on the far left covers 35 years. The other thing that you need to remember about this, especially if you're looking for baptisms, for babies being born, is maybe you find in the parish register 4 babies to this couple and you think that's all the children they had. Might not be, it might just be all the ones that were born during the span that that book covers. There could be more born either before or after that particular register covers. So the 155 missing ones, what happened to them? Everybody wishes they knew. I'm hoping that the next Indiana Jones movie is going to be Indiana Jones and the box of Virginia Parish Register books. He'll be 112 when he makes it, but I don't pick him. I have seen at least one theory, and I don't know how realistic it is, that a lot of the parish priests may have thought that those record books they were keeping were more their own personal record than the church's record. And when the revolution came along, most of those parish priests were not very welcome in America because they were British sympathizers, and they were sent back to England. And maybe some of them took the books with them when they left. But that's just a theory. Now there was a different parish book that I'll hit on just a little bit at the end that was the vestry book. And it's a totally different thing than the register book, and we'll talk about it just a little bit. Now when we go down to North Carolina, things were a little different in North Carolina. North Carolina was a little more rural. They didn't have the organized society that Tidewater, Virginia had. So in the late 1600s, there weren't a whole lot of ministers around in North Carolina. And the law said that a couple could marry in the presence of 3 or 4 neighbors and some government representative, either the governor or a member of the governor's council. Now, I have trouble believing that the governor rode around and just announced, I'm in town for 4 hours if anybody wants to get married while I'm here. So I don't think that happened very often. We don't find many records of that happening. But then in 1741, the General Assembly said only the Church of England can perform marriages, same as what Virginia's been doing for years. But in the absence of a minister, and they were having trouble getting Anglican ministers in North Carolina, so there were a lot of places that didn't have them, then magistrates can do the wedding in that case. As I said, it just wasn't as well settled. They had a vast shortage of any kind of ministers in North Carolina. And this is different than Virginia, because Virginia, you still had to be a minister. The couple did still either have to buy a license or get the marriage bands, one or the other. And then as other denominations came into North Carolina, they relaxed it a little bit to say that other ministers could perform marriages as long as the state got their fee out of the deal. That's the main thing that the state was concerned about, was getting their money out of the deal. So again, that was a little different than Virginia was. The Anglicans weren't too happy about this because it cut in on one of their lines of income. One priest wrote, there were Irish dissenters and other motley mixtures who were trying to perform weddings now. So after the Revolution then, any minister or person in public office could perform marriages, but they still had to either post a bond or have the banns read before the wedding took place. And that lasted up until almost the Civil War. And it's estimated that 2/3 of the weddings at that time were done by the bands because it was so much cheaper mostly. And since those bands were not considered public record, you're not going to find them in any archive records. They're just not there. The marriage bonds should be, but you're not going to find those bands. And since so many people live back in the backwoods, away from civilization, so to speak, it was pretty common apparently that ministers and magistrates and everybody else just kind of sidestepped the law and did whatever they wanted. It wasn't until 1851 that it became a requirement to get a marriage license and return it to the courthouse. And then finally, after the Civil War in 1868, a license became the only way to get married in the state. Now what this means to you and me is that a lot of our ancestors' marriage records from North Carolina just don't exist. You can look and think you're in the wrong county or think you're in the wrong year, but the fact is, it just ain't there. Now, if you're from South Carolina, that's pretty simple. South Carolina didn't require the government, the state, to take a role in marriage until 1911. Before that, it was strictly a function of the church. And so about the only way that you're going to find early marriages in South Carolina is either if they were in a newspaper, like this book from Brent Holcomb is, newspaper announcements, or if you might stumble up on some old church records. Both of them exist, not very many though. So in South Carolina, I don't know that I have ever found any of my family's record of marriages, unless maybe they lived in Charleston where they would have had a newspaper. Now some of the rules for marriage, these were the laws and the guidelines. Now let's talk about the couple getting married. The first marriage laws in Virginia were passed in 1632, just not long after they landed at Jamestown. And those stayed pretty much the same for well over 200 years. The legal age to marry without permission was 21 for either of the couple. And rarely did a man under the age of 21 get married. I know we all have visions of Granny Clampett. You remember she used to be concerned because Ellie Mae was plumb near 13 and still wasn't married yet. And I think sometimes we think that in those older days they did get married really young. But it was really just the opposite case. They did not get married young in Virginia. Now, early on in the 17th and 18th centuries, officials were especially concerned about brides under age 16 getting married without consent. And county clerks were not supposed to issue a marriage license without getting a written permission from a parent or guardian. And then after 1748, they stiffened it up a little and said not just a parent, it has to be the daddy. So if you find a marriage permission during that earliest period signed by the mother, you can pretty well guess that daddy was not around any longer, or at least incapacitated to some extent, because the father was supposed to be the one to give permission. And you did have, obviously there's always going to be a but. They finally said that the father did not have to give written permission if he gave verbal permission to the clerk. Well, since nobody had their cell phone out videoing it at the time, we don't have a record of that verbal permission. But what you might look at is see if the bride's daddy signed the bond. Because if he's standing there at the counter in the courthouse with them, and he signs the bond, you can kind of figure that he's giving permission as well. So that's another reason that you need to look to see who the bondsman is. Now, did everything always work by the book? Of course not. It still doesn't. There were exceptions. There were people sneaking around the rules. There were people doing anything else, just like they are today. This is one from Rockbridge County, Virginia, and it just happens to be my ancestor, is the reason I used it. And this is in 1788. It's a permission slip for Mary Priestley to marry John Doris. Now, the first thing that I see on here is that both mother and daddy, William and Mary, signed it. Even though only the daddy really needed to, but mother signed it anyway. And they apparently sent that permission slip with their oldest son, James Priestley, who signs as the only witness. Supposed to be 2 witnesses by law, but they only have one, the bride's big brother, James. But here's the part that I find a little funny. James Priestley's signature looks an awful lot to me like William Priestley's signature and Mary Priestley's signature. Imagine that. Especially when you know that he also, if you can barely see down at the bottom, is the one that signed the bond for his future brother-in-law. So he was with them at the courthouse. He delivered this permission and he signed the bond. But 3 years later, another daughter in the same family gets married. This is for my daughter Elizabeth to marry. Now this time, only daddy signed. Mother was still alive, I know, but only daddy signed. But daddy has somehow in the last 3 years forgotten how to sign his name. Now he can only make a mark. And instead of big brother being the witness and the bondsman, it's now Joseph Lapsley, who was an elder in her church, because he was also my ancestor. So I figure daddy really knew that Joseph Lapsley was taking permission. And just a few years after that, when daddy died, he still could not sign his name. He signed it just with a mark. Any guesses on which one of his children is not even mentioned in his estate?
James.
And I'm just guessing, I can't prove it, but you can't prove me wrong. I'm just guessing that this daughter got married without permission, and as a result, daddy pretty much disinherited her. Because she was still living in the area, I think. She's not even mentioned in his will. So I think that big brother might have been in cahoots with her on her getting married. Now, as I said, the General Assembly was really concerned about teenage girls getting married and teenagers in general. In 1696, they passed a law that said if an underage girl gets married without permission, she loses their inheritance. So for them then, it didn't matter if daddy wanted to disinherit her. It was law that she was to be disinherited. But if an underage child married and then was widowed, they were considered an adult and didn't have to get permission the second time. Now, guys, think about this just a minute. You are a fairly recent groom, and your wife says one night, you know, I really wanted to marry Bob, but Daddy wouldn't let me. But, you know, if you were dead, then I could marry Bob without permission. Don't you think there were a lot of really nervous husbands running around? It was totally illegal for indentured servants to marry without the master's permission, and they rarely gave that permission. And since most of the indentured servants had come over in their teens or early 20s, and usually that indenture was for several years, you're probably not going to find indentured servants marrying until up into their late 20s. They weren't going to be getting married as young. Slaves, it was just illegal for them to marry in any way, shape, or form. But common law marriage among slaves was recognized more than you might think. On the Mount Vernon estate records, George Washington's estate record, they show that 2/3 of the slaves at Mount Vernon were considered married in 1799. And then after the Civil War in North Carolina, now this is not a North Carolina record, this is actually a Freedmen's Bureau record. But they did say that if a couple who has been living together as husband and wife while slaves will come and swear, we've been living together as husband and wife since 1850 or whatever, they would issue them a marriage license saying that they had been married since that point. And this is the same thing on the Freedmen's Bureau. It says they've been living together since October 28, 1843, I believe is what it says. And then it lists all of the children that were born that they now considered legitimate because they were born of what they considered that marriage. In 1792, the Virginia Assembly had passed an act defining marriage rules, and one of the things that I find interesting is they said that any marriages within a certain line of kinship are null and void. Now, what makes me really nervous about this is that how many of you have found old records of first or second cousins marrying? Okay, if first cousins could marry, then what were they talking about that could not? If it was somebody closer than that, you know, did they think they had to put in the law to say this is a little too close, you can't marry your sister? It was also made a felony, gentlemen, you might want to remember this, it was a felony to kidnap and marry a widow or a woman under the age of consent without her or her parents' permission. So you had to remember that when you're riding off with her slung over your shoulder, that it was considered a felony unless she said it was all right for you to do. There weren't any laws concerning divorce or separation or desertion, and so they wound up with cartoons kind of like this one that I found. You just were stuck with them, that's all you could make up. I'm sure that all of those things took place, they just did not have legal boundaries set by the government to go. One last thing is that I said earlier that there was a difference in parish registers and parish vestry books. The register kept up with births, marriages, and deaths. The vestry book kept up with the social aspects of the community, with taking care of widows and children, with making sure that property lines were set right, with calling people before the vestry board for things like drunkenness, fornication, missing church too often, swearing in public. So it was the social services book of the community. There were a few churches that kept the register and the vestry book in the same book. But for the most part, just because you find the parish you're looking for, if it's the vestry book, you're still not going to find that marriage record that you want. You might have a parish book because there's a few of those vestry books still existing too. But it still might not be the records that you're looking for. So the summary that I want to give is just because you don't find the marriage that you're looking for. And I had told David that the title of this I wanted to be Grandma and Grandpa Had a Secret Wedding, I hope. And the I hope part just got left off. Just because you don't find the record of the wedding that you're looking for, don't think the worst of them. You are probably legit. They probably really got married. It's just that it doesn't matter how or where or how long you look, those records just probably don't exist. They're just not there anymore. If they ever were there in writing, they're not anymore. Any questions I might be able to answer? Yes, sir?
I've heard about, in the past, records being lost because of fires. How often, when you're looking at, like, say, your own family, did you see a fire event happen where records were lost in a fire?
There's several counties in Virginia that lost everything, because if the British didn't burn it, the Yankees did. And to me, the most tragic ones, and I'm not even sure now which counties, in Charlotte City County, I think is one of them. But during the Civil War, that they took the records from the courthouse for safekeeping and carried them to Richmond. Charles City didn't get burned, Richmond did. So, but there are, I don't know, the counties in Virginia, I'm gonna guess, any of y'all know, I bet there's at least 12 or 15 of the counties in Virginia that lost most, if not all, of their records. And even when you get up more recent, there's nothing in Henderson County before 1895, because that's the last time their courthouse burned. What other West Tennessee counties have burned and lost records besides Henderson? That's the one I know of. But way too often, there's Hanover County, Virginia is burned, New Kent County, I think, Charlotte City County, and naturally, it's always the one you're looking for. But yeah, a lot of those counties lost either all or part of their records.
Those parish records that do exist, it's about 20 maybe, are they easy to find on the?
Most of those have probably been published into book form. And I would say, Evelyn, you have the majority of those parishes, I think.
We have many of them.
And if not, a lot of them are probably on Family Search. Now, the problem is they're not gonna be indexed or anything.
Yeah.
You may just have to search through, and then you're reading very creative handwriting. But all of the ones that exist that I have looked for are somewhat easy to find. Now, the other thing, of course, you get to is that some people are gonna publish it verbatim, word for word, and some people are just going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Just pull what they feel is the important parts out of it. And you may get something, transcribed wrong or left out of place. Yeah, for the most part, they're fairly easy to find. You just have to kind of know which parish you're looking for, by finding a map of the counties and showing which parish is lined up with that county.
Were the deaths listed in the parish,
Supposed to be
and the births and the christenings?
births, or christenings actually, probably more so than births. And not only the families' christenings, but also the slave births were supposed to be listed in there. And the marriages, and then I don't know if it was deaths or burials, but basically the same thing. We're supposed to be in the parish priest record book.
Same from Tennessee, usually.
Well, see, Tennessee didn't come along until after the church parishes were gone. So they never did have church parish record books. Now, you might find a church or two that would have church records. I know Larry St. Luke's, I know, still has some of their oldest church records. So you might find a church that has old church records, but as far as the register book, yeah. But as far as the parish register, that had gone by the wayside before Tennessee came into being.